A very warm welcome to this episode of the Navigating Risk podcast. My name is Luca Rosi, Deputy Editor Global Content at Gallagher, and your host for today's episode. We are joined by Michelle Sequeira, EVP Growth Leader at Gallagher, and Chris Andrew, Communication Consulting Lead at Gallagher. Michelle and Chris discuss the employee value proposition both from a communications and policy program perspective. Chris, Michelle, could you please introduce yourselves and tell our listeners a little bit about your backgrounds?
I'm Chris Andrew, so I lead strategic planning and communication consulting at Gallagher. I'm one side of EVP when it comes to employee value proposition. I have a background in marketing, communications, and driving sustainable behavioral change. My focus is very much on working with organizations to help them to connect with their people in ways that truly matter in order to drive organizational performance. So EVP is something that actually I started my career doing in employer branding and talent attraction at an agency many, many years ago. And I'm delighted to be talking about it more and really helping to drive it forward. So happy to be here.
It is lovely to be here. Thank you, Luca. My name is Michelle Sequeira. I am the Proposition Growth Leader for EVP here at Gallagher. My background, I've just got under 20 years of corporate and consulting experience working with well over 100 organizations on anything talent and people strategy related. I'd say my subject matter expertise is threefold. I've done a fair amount of work when it comes to EVP strategy, design, and enablement. I've worked with a number of organizations on strategic workforce planning, identifying the skills for the future and how to narrow those gaps, and talent management, redesigns and enablements, whether it comes to redesigning, performance management, or talent acquisition, etc. All of those tie in really nicely to EVP because ultimately it ensures that an organization is set up to focus on their business strategy while ensuring that their people are enabled and performing at their best. So I'm really excited to be talking about EVP Reimagined.
Thank you both. So let's start at the beginning, I guess, with a definition of EVP. We're talking about employee value proposition because I know that there's also employer value proposition. So for those that aren't aware of the nuances of definitions, could you kindly just outline what exactly we mean by employee value proposition?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify, to us it's one and the same. We see it as an amalgamation of twofold. I think EVP is often misunderstood. For some of my clients, it's misunderstood to be a reward strategy. For others, it is employer branding or employee branding alone. And really at its core, we see EVP as being the strategic blueprint that frankly aligns workforce expectation, what employees actually want, with that brand promise. How do we stand out in a market? And with business ambition to ensure that everything that we put forward actually ensures our business thrives. And it's the amalgamation of all three of those that enables an organization to attract and engage and retain the right talent that will drive that transformation. If I were to explain it in another way that is less HRD related perhaps, it's the bridge, it's the link between what an organization promises its people and what those people actually experience. That's the reality, right? It's what an organization offers versus what people actually expect and receive. And it should never be that flashy bumper sticker that's on a beautiful website. It really needs to be felt in those everyday moments that people have. It needs to be embedded in that culture and the leadership. It really needs to be meaningfully experienced. Chris, from a branding and a narrative perspective, would you like to add a little bit to that?
Well, so yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think that everything you've said, you've articulated it beautifully in terms of answering that question. Why should the people that you want to hire want to come and work with you rather than anywhere else? So what it is that bit that makes you stand out, but also, as you say, the importance of that give and the get or the deal or the psychological contract, they're all ultimately the same thing. I think what's really important, to your point, Michelle, that I think depending on who you talk to, they have a different understanding of what EVP is. Arguably, if you talk to your employees, they have no idea what EVP is. So tip one, don't go out and say, hey, where's the new EVP? Because nobody knows what it is. However, it's really important. And I think that there's a couple of areas here, and why I think Michelle and I working really well together is that there's sort of two sides to the EVP or the employer brand story. One is the story that you tell, and the messaging that you use, and the nuances, and how you reflect and connect that to your brand. But that is only as good as the reality of the lived experiences, as Michelle said. And what we see in a lot of data is that over half of the people that we speak to, the lived experience doesn't reflect the EVP employer brand story that they're told on a daily basis. So it absolutely has to be backed up. In the same way that if we think about marketing, you can tell a fantastic story about a product and encourage people to buy into it. But if that product doesn't work, or if it doesn't do what people were expecting it to do, then they're not going to buy it again. They're going to get a refund. It's exactly the same with EVP. We tell people a story, and it needs to be backed up in the reality of what it feels like. And that is complex and nuanced. There are regulatory elements, there are employment rights and elements, there are reflecting the sort of shifting employee expectations around flexible work and flexible benefits and so on and so forth, and having opportunities. All these things that are multifaceted, and it's a complex world. But ultimately what we're trying to do is make that a really clear, believable, authentic story about why should people come and work here rather than anywhere else.
Thank you. I'm glad I've got you both to dissect EVP for sure. Just picking up on lived experience versus reality, how can organizations close the EVP gap? And also, how can they ensure that they have perhaps the right scaffolding and foundations in place? I'd just be interested to hear more about the EVP gap.
Yeah, absolutely. The EVP gap really emerges when that strategy and that narrative we've put forward and the execution aren't joined up. So policies, reward structures, benefits design, talent management, all of these need to either reinforce, and really should reinforce, or frankly, sometimes they undermine that EVP. So for example, if an organization wants their people promise or their EVP to focus on inclusion and equity, the way this shows up and should be designed and played out in reality is across 3 layers, right? So the first is in the offer. Pay and recognition should be considered with, say, for example, a lens of fair living wages and pay equity, and benefits are redesigned with inclusion at its core. The second aspect is across the colleague life cycle. So with that inclusion lens, career development is made accessible and equitable. Talent management practices such as recruitment and performance management, those should be redesigned to remove bias and foster fairness. And then that third layer is in the moments that matter. Now, these will vary by individual and experiences, and very often, unfortunately, they are shaped by systemic and unconscious biases. So for this organization that does indeed want to prioritize inclusion and equity, designing those moments that matter and the offering around those will be pivotal for experiences that have that meaningful impact. And to your wording on scaffolding, it's in those moments that when we provide the right scaffolding in times where actually it matters the most, that's what makes a difference for employees to thrive.
Yeah, I think closing the gap, there's a number of elements to it. From a communication perspective, it's about making sure that there is a consistent experience. Employees don't differentiate necessarily between different elements, whether that's about reward and benefits or onboarding or opportunities or performance management or career development. All of these elements are aspects of their experience as an employee. A lot of the time where we get asked to support an organization is around, they might believe that they've got an effective external employer brand, so they're not struggling to recruit the right kinds of people, but there isn't always the consistency of that message when it actually comes into the day-to-day business as usual employee experience. And I think that's where a lot of organizations don't necessarily think about following through on some of those messages from an attraction perspective. Some work that we've been doing with the recent organization was very much focused actually on not necessarily articulating the message, but thinking about how, when, and where should we prioritize the areas that they really want to focus on. That will be unique to every organization based on where it's at. It's not necessarily on timing. The number of times I've worked with organizations where we've created a beautiful playbook with messaging and hierarchies and narratives and pillars and all of that kind of stuff, and it sits on a shelf in an HR department gathering dust because it's hard to activate in a meaningful way across the 100-odd touch points that employees experience every single day. So the focus we've seen success in is starting to sort of break down and be realistic about a few key elements that are going to have a really positive difference. For that client, for example, it was actually a minor refresh of their careers website, but also actually adding front page to their employment contract. We've all been there where you're sort of connected to this organization. You've had conversations with managers and other employees, and you're all excited, and you're in that honeymoon moment about making sure that this is the right decision for you, and you've chosen this brand, and maybe it's a cool, quirky brand that's gonna really push you forward. And then you get 45 pages of legalese through the post that starts with your notice period 6 months, and it's like, right, does that reflect the brand message? So obviously you still need that legalese and you need that contractual connection, but these are moments where you can bring in that message, be personalized, reflect your values, get that value proposition through, so that people can say in that moment, yes, I've made the right decision here, I'm excited about this. And those little moments can make a massive difference. So I think for me, it's about identifying those moments, big or small, where closing that gap is going to have as big an impact as possible, rather than just relying on sort of cyclical updates to benefits enrollment websites or reward, the bonus pay review or whatever it might be. Starting to think a bit more intentionally about the areas that you want to focus on.
Yeah, love the moments that matter. It's so important, isn't it? And also it's linked to line managers as well, isn't it? Because they're the sort of the conduit between the employee and getting them almost access to those benefits at times when they need it most as well. But I think that's very powerful. Switching gears a little bit, I think we hear a lot about retention, and also competition for talent is red hot. It's an uncertain time. It's difficult. Skills are always in the spotlight. So I was curious to hear from you both. How can organizations position themselves as employers of choice, and obviously how does the EVP help them do that?
Sure. So we've spoken a little bit about what an EVP is and the importance of it reflecting the lived experience. But if we think about it from a talent attraction and retention perspective, that EVP and the employer brand is about making sure that you are attracting and keeping the right talent, which I think is also really important. It feels like a bit of an odd thing to say, but a good employer brand should be as effective at putting the wrong people off your organization as it should be to be attracting the right people to your business. So it's very important to make sure that there is clarity and openness and honesty when it comes to that message, obviously backed up with the proof points. But I think it also needs to, in order to be an employer of choice, it needs to reflect the evolving needs of the people that you really want to hire, and focus on what you're going to need to succeed and achieve your goals. I think it's important to understand what employer of choice means for your organization and in your industry, because that will vary. And there are a number of different levers within sort of EVP in terms of the framework and how we work with organizations to help them to build their own EVP is based on a number of different elements that may be about reward, but actually more often than not, it's about other things. It's about purpose and about opportunity and about well-being and about a sense of belonging and connection. And all of those other things are levers that you can pull in order to create that environment, create that story. I think employer of choice are like top employers and things that they're important and they're really helpful, but that's going to be unique to every organization, I think, and making sure that you've got clarity on what your story is and what kind of people you're looking for is really key. And then that story ideally needs to be woven into, this is my naive, idealistic view, that story needs to be woven into every employee touch point. Now, I'm aware that is a challenge. And that's why, as we were talking about the importance of sort of prioritizing and identifying the areas that are going to have impact. But in order for that employer of choice piece to really come through, it needs to reflect that story, I think, every day. I don't know, Michelle, your thoughts on that employer of choice piece, because I guess there's the other side of things that is about making sure that you are fit for purpose as an organization in terms of compliance and, rights and all of those incredibly important things that I haven't touched upon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even if you track back on employee research and what employees want over the last few years, right? But you were talking about it goes beyond reward into benefits, etc. Actually, career progression and learning and development has often been the top retainer for talent, and not pay, not rewards, right? The only time pay actually shot up was when the cost of living spiked. So to make sure that opportunities are available, and they don't always have to be vertical progression, but to make sure that there is career development, there's learning, this tends to make a really big difference in becoming that employer of choice. But actually, being an employer of choice is as much about fairness and transparency about it as it is about the offer. So if I just keep with that careers and learning and development opportunities piece for a second, one of the organizations I worked with had said they had fantastic high potential programs. However, when you looked at the data and who got those high potential programs, the data suggests there was a misalignment with those that actually had the high performance metrics. So that needs altering. So there's where organizations are wanting to be employers of choice. And we see this often, right, where they've hit a charter or they've met certain criteria, actually is translating that to ensuring there's that fairness, that authenticity in what translates into the employee experience. And that's the same to your point there, Chris, on regulation. This is increasingly important when it comes to pay transparency and the regulations that are coming, not just across Europe, but we're seeing an increasing demand in the UK when it comes to disability pay gap metrics, for example, or race metrics, right? So with regulation coming into perhaps a sharper focus, EVP really needs to stand up to the scrutiny that will surround it. And thinking about being an employer of choice, this is actually where EVP starts to become a risk mitigation tool as much as it is a talent lever.
Michelle, would you like to just expand a little bit about risk mitigation, please? Because obviously people risk is one of the fundamental kind of themes in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a few key people risks, right, and talent challenges that organizations are facing. The first that's no surprise to anybody is the regulations. I'll touch on that because we've just commented on it. And whether that is the Worker Protection Act that came out over the last couple of years. As of December, there was an Employment Rights Act that has come to the fore. And whether that is looking a little bit more globally at EU pay transparency or gender representation, the regulatory landscape poses a huge risk to organizations if they do not comply. For some countries, for example, there are percentages of payroll fees that they need to pay if they do not adhere or meet the gaps that the law states. So that's the first aspect. I think the second people risk element is actually skills and competition for skills and the need to meet those skills gaps. And we can touch more on the types of skills. In fact, there's another fantastic podcast that will go into this in a little bit more detail shortly. But I think, organizations are grappling with how do we attract and retain the right skills for the future. And there needs to be more that organizations do to think through what that looks like and whether they need to reskill their people now versus buying in talent elsewhere. Maybe it is redeploying from other parts of the business, whether it is talent marketplaces. There are a few strategies that an organization can pull on. And I think the third piece there is right now we are at a pivotal time where organizations have increased costs, they increased taxes. For certain firms, they're feeling the pinch when it comes to national insurance increases, right? So organizations have a lot to deal with increased costs and think through what they need to do and how do they prioritize that. For some organizations, that translates into, and unfortunately, this is a reality. Actually, I'm going to cut my learning and development offerings or my benefits for my people. And by doing so and cutting such things quite quickly can actually be a derailer and have unintended consequences, where right now is where you do need to focus on your people to ensure that you thrive across these turbulent times.
If I can go to you, Chris, perhaps on this one in terms of EVP playbooks, but also more generally for those organizations that are unsure in terms of where to start to really cement their EVP and create a powerful, compelling EVP. What would you advise? What would you recommend? Where should they start?
So there's a few things, and Michelle and I have got similar views on this, so I'll come to you as well. But so the playbook is really sort of a catch-all term for sort of guidance as to how to make sure that you're articulating and messaging and rolling out and communicating an EVP or employer brand in a consistent way. They can be small or they can be huge. I think the important thing is really about making sure that in order to create that environment, if we go back to the things that we believe are going to come together to culminate in an EVP, it is what do your current and future people expect from you as a business? What does your business need from its people in order to succeed, and what makes you stand out? And I think any kind of diagnostic exercise that we would do as a start would be to answer those questions. So there's a key piece around making sure that you are listening to your people and getting an understanding of the current sentiment, what it really feels like on the ground. What does a good day look like? What does a bad day look like? What does this organization really value? And what do I value as an employee? And what are the challenges? I think there is a competitor element to this. What is it that makes you unique or makes you stand out as an organization? And you can do that by looking at yourself, but it's also more helpful to look at your competitors and how they are talking about themselves and what they are offering. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be doing them the same. And I have long, exciting conversations with some of my benefits colleagues about a sort of a chicken and egg situation. Does benefits design drive an EVP, or does EVP drive benefits design? I believe it's the latter, personally, but because it should be driving the story that you're trying to tell and the benefits that you create drive that story. Anyway, I digress. But that competitive element is really important, because you need to understand what the market looks like, and that shouldn't be any different. And I think it's also important not just to look at the brands that represent your customer competitors, but actually it's really more about the sort of role types and locations within your organization. So, for example, we work with an energy provider based up in Nottingham, and actually their obvious competitors aren't other energy providers. They're people that have got, large head offices in the Nottingham area, for example, which might be in a totally different industry, but actually represents their competitors. So I think it's really important to do that piece of work. And then the final piece is, what does your business need from its people in order to succeed? And that's conversations with leaders. It's understanding the business strategy. It's understanding where you're trying to go as an organization in terms of your purpose and your values and so on and so forth, and connecting all of those three things together, but with a conscious, always on consideration for making sure that you're doing things in an inclusive way, that you are providing the right kind of environment that is reflective of the 21st century. So that's where I would start in those three areas to help you to answer that question.
Chris, I would agree, right? With which informs the other, with the chicken and egg conversation just there, that I firmly believe that EVP should inform rewards, benefits design, how and where you set your stall by way of benchmarking, and not the other way around. And we've seen this play out with organizations that if they do their benefits strategy and benefits offering prior to thinking through, well, actually, what do they stand for as an organization, and what their holistic value proposition, their holistic people strategy is, it does them a disservice. Because actually, for one of the organizations, they had all of their values on the wall behind them, and they could just translate, actually, these benefits are completely misaligned to what you are saying our values are. So I think there is a huge benefit in starting with, well, what should our EVP look like, and then inform all aspects of the EVPs. So how does that translate to the actual question, Luca, that you asked? I believe that the playbook should include those checks and balances that ensure that this EVP is in line with the offer, the talent management processes, the culture, etc. And just to give you another client example, right? One of the organizations we worked with had wanted to transition and reposition themselves to be fully innovative. But when speaking to the FD and saying, so as people come up with experiments, if they fail, what happens then? What performance actually matters? And this FD turned around and said, well, no, Michelle, failure is not an option. So then what matters, what performance matters, and what we reward is doing their purpose and their EVP a disservice, and ensuring that those don't contradict each other will serve that organization in better stead. And the wider research shows this really well, right? So our most recent workforce trends report actually suggested 69.7, let's round that up to 70%, of organizations now have flexible benefits. Fantastic, brilliant. But only 17.6% provide genuine choice with comprehensive platforms. So here too, there's a gap between the aspiration and then the delivery of that. And I think when you are thinking about what good looks like and what you should have in that playbook, making sure that your EVP guides those decisions and you've got the right checks and balances, that it's fully embedded, will really benefit you as organizations.
That's great. Thank you so much. Michelle, maybe I'll start with you on this one, but metrics and diagnostics. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, please? Because some of our listeners may be wondering, what are the metrics that we should be targeting?
I love a good metric. I am a psychologist by background, and goodness, I like my data. Look, I always believe you've got to start with the diagnostics and not the design, because that helps you think through, well, what are the true priorities that will make the most impact? So I typically talk about triangulating insights from three areas and three data points. And the first is looking at what is the employee sentiment. So, for example, what do employees actually experience today? Where is perception misaligned with reality? And so starting to understand, well, actually, what derails that employee experience or what amplifies it and makes people thrive. But then adding to that, well, what does the workforce data tell us? Because sometimes perception isn't the law. It's only 9/10 of it. So let's understand, well, what do those talent flows tell us? Are there discrepancies with how we do pay people or how people do progress? Or to my high potential example earlier on, the people that do get into the high potential programs, let's understand the data to really stress test what are the myths and what is reality. But then add to that policy versus practice. So Chris previously talked about legalese, right, and having huge contracts. We see that so often with organizations. Some might pride themselves on having beautiful policies, but in fact, when you then look at the practice of it, so a flexible working policy versus who's allowed to take flexible working, that practice might be very different. And so aligning all of those will help you to understand what actually matters, where do we need to prioritize, what's going to make the most impact. You start to tease out, well, where are the biggest people risks and where are those most material to the business. And I think, that will then help you prioritize, because I think you all know I like a good strap line. Clarity beats completeness, right? So we were talking about there's so much that we might want to do, but if we have to focus on things, especially right now where we have cost pressures, we have regulations being thrown at us, we've got so many different competing priorities. If we can just focus on three things at a time and not boil the ocean and do too much, that helps you as within HR teams or you as leaders, but it also ensures that your employees have a seamless experience.
Clarity beats completeness. I'll certainly remember that. And that leads me on to our kind of top takeaways, advice. We always like to end with some tangible, practical nuggets of wisdom from our guests that obviously our listeners can take away and perhaps implement.
The importance of a holistic approach. I think it's really important to not think about EVP as being one thing or another. It's not a reward strategy. It's not a talent attraction campaign. It is the foundation that should help to inform really how you make design decisions, but also how you communicate with your current and future people. So whatever that is, and I think it's really important, I don't think we've mentioned this before, is that, every organization, everyone listening to this, their organization already has an employer brand or an employee value proposition, whether they're in control of that narrative or not, because a lot of it is about perceptions, as Michelle says. And if the team, and it's not about, and I think the other thing which is important is that it's not an HR thing, and it's not just a leadership thing, it's not just an internal comms thing, and it's not just IT or facilities, but actually all of those elements are parts of the employee experience. And I think that this is the kind of thing that needs to be holistically owned, which is really important. But because without that, it is difficult to take ownership. And if organizations aren't taking ownership of that story, making sure that the experience reflects that reality, then it's going to be showing up on Reddit and on Glassdoor and at the virtual water cooler and all of those other areas where that story is being created for you. So I think there's something about an awareness of the fact that all organizations already have this value proposition. It's about identifying the areas that you can start to drive and make a meaningful change to that in an agile way. And I think Michelle and I were talking about this the other day. We need to reflect the way in which we do things, or we need to design the way in which we develop EVPs and roll out EVPs in the way that employees are used to experiencing communication. That needs to be agile and it needs to be iterative. And we need to be able to pilot and test and refine as we go, but notwithstanding the fact that I think it's important that your employee value proposition, in the same way that your business purpose doesn't change year or year, or certainly shouldn't change year on year, that there is a clear story, but how you bring that to life, and how it evolves will be an iterative process.
And from my perspective, and I fully agree with everything, Chris, that you've said, I think, because my head always goes to people risk, right? People risk grows fastest when promises and reality diverge. Right. So I would say there are 3 top takeaways from myself. Treat EVP as a strategic lever where you aren't working on reward in a silo with benefits in a silo. It has to be across the business to ensure your people's strategy is truly felt. The second is focus on credibility over comprehensiveness. So making sure that everything that is being put forward is as authentic and is as embedded into every aspect of the EVP, I think is really important. And the third goes literally back to the last question that we had, is pick 3 top priorities and execute them exceptionally well. That's how you start to build momentum, and also test the return on investment so that you can go further, you can go faster and wider as well.
That's great. I can only just thank you both again for your time today. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it, and hopefully our listeners will too. So thank you both, Michelle and Chris, for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Been a pleasure, Luca, as always.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Chris and Michelle on the fascinating and multi-layered topic that is the employee value proposition. You can, of course, download the reports mentioned, the State of the Sector Employee Comms Report and the UK Workforce Trends Report. Please do join us next time. Thanks again for listening. Bye for now.